Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ben Talks About. I'm of course your host Ben Contreras, and a couple of weeks ago, a little game on the Nintendo Switch called The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom finally came out after multiple delays, exceeding that of last year, which was its initial release year at that point. But it's finally out now. People have been playing it, people have been reviewing it, and people have been building really crazy stuff in it. So I thought it was about time for me to do a Ben Talks About video on it. Now, just for clarification, this is going to be more so a first impressions video on the game, because I've had the game for a certain number of weeks now, but I haven't gotten overly far into the game, if that much progress at all. So this is going to be more so my initial 2 cents on the game overall, with my sort of minimal experience on the game so far. So if you were expecting any sort of like story spoilers or anything like that, there really should not be any in this one at all. Most of the spoilers come from the actual gameplay of it rather than the story. So with that in mind, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom here is basically a sort of direct sequel to the previous Zelda game, Zelda Breath of the Wild, which, you know, of course was the one that started this whole open world style to the Zelda games. And the fact that it is a sequel is most definitely present, because the world itself is very similar to Breath of the Wild. The overall map structure is very similar to it, but there is enough new stuff added to it so that I don't think it would be all that noticeable that it's more or less the same old world from the previous game. And it feels like this one is, I won't go into too much detail, but I feel like the game is much more story driven compared to Breath of the Wild, because that game had very little storytelling on the surface, aside from the different flashbacks you can see from going to all the areas where you get Link's memories back and all that. So the game is definitely a lot more centered around the story. There's definitely a lot more cutscenes that are fully voiced in the game compared to Breath of the Wild. So that is if you felt like the story in the previous game was a bit too minimal for your taste, especially when it comes to a Zelda game, then this game is definitely much more better when it comes to giving you a more of a narrative rather than keeping it more so ambiguous, like how Breath of the Wild did. So overall, the game, in terms of overall gameplay, it plays again very similarly to Breath of the Wild. You still have breakable weapons, you still have the stamina meter from Skyward Sword making a return, you still have all of the shrines that you go to in order to get the items, in order to increase your hearts and increase your stamina and all that. A lot of the core mechanics of Breath of the Wild are still there, but there are some things that are different, that, again, I feel like this game stands out on its own in a positive way compared to Breath of the Wild. One of the major things is that the abilities that you can get in the game are very different compared to the previous title. Some of the ones that were useful in that game, however, they took away and replaced it with a different mechanic, which, you know, that's perfectly fine. I don't necessarily mind that very much. I believe one of the only abilities that carries on from the previous Zelda game was the sort of magnetic sort of ability that Link gets early on in the game, where you're able to grab like certain objects and able to like move them around and stuff. That one is still there, but it feels like it doesn't have as much flow to it. It feels a lot more stiff when you're trying to move objects around, and you're not able to as effectively use it as like weapons against your enemy unless it's like an explosive barrel. But in that case, using that as a weapon is kind of something you'd have to expect using that power. The other abilities that you got in the previous game were such as the one where you get to like paralyze an object, and then after you hit it enough times and the paralysis wears off, it starts launching into the air. As far as I know, that ability is nowhere to be seen in this game. One of the newer ones that you're able to do are ones where you're able to take certain objects and sort of rewind them through time, which is mostly used for like solving certain puzzles in the shrines. So and also one of the two different bomb abilities that you got in the previous game aren't in this one either. They actually brought back the bomb flowers from the previous Zelda games and put it into this one, which I thought was a pretty decent touch. But I feel like they're, especially early on in the game, they're kind of scarce. So you really got to sort of dig deep in order to find those, especially if you want to stock up on bombs, which is fine, but also at the same time it sort of limits you um, in terms of the stuff that you can do in like certain areas, because there are certain parts in the game where, like any other Zelda game, where what where a pathway in like a cave or like a certain area in like a dungeon is being blocked off by a bunch of rocks, which you would usually use like a bomb, like in the other traditional Zelda games. But since it's more of a item that you have to sort of like gather up and save up for those certain points, you may find yourself, especially if you're first starting out, sort of limited on in terms of certain areas you can go to at the very start. So you'll spend first few moments of the game sort of going around in the overworld and gathering certain items so that you can make more in terms of overall like progression, especially if you want to get certain items very early on. But that's one of the things that I think is a sort of highlight about this game, is that they give you a lot of freedom to get stuff very, very early, which is, I think, is on one side that's a good thing, because it allows you to have a lot more freedom in the game without it being like overly ambiguous as to what you're supposed to do, like in Breath of the Wild. But at the same time, I also feel like it gives you a bit too much to do at the start, because after the tutorial of the game ends, you're basically thrown into the game you're given a sort of direction, but there's nothing stopping you from breaching off of that path. But I feel like the game sort of encourages you to spend the first couple of hours gathering certain things up before like going deeper and getting more and more in terms of like progression in the story and in terms of like areas you can go to, especially since in this game you start out with only like 3 or 4 hearts, I believe. So that, alongside the fact that there are definitely a lot more enemies in this game, I feel like they sort of they can sort of get overwhelming if you're just starting out. Because one of the things that they added were there are a lot more enemy base camps that you can go ahead and raid to get certain items. But I feel like, especially again, if you're just starting out, you're sort of encouraged to not exactly do that yet, unless your skills in the overall gameplay, which is is not overly complicated to begin with. I feel like they sort of encourage you to sort of like stay away from certain enemies until you get to a certain point where you feel like you're able to defend yourself a lot more easily. So yeah, if you are going to be playing this game, I definitely recommend not trying to fight enemies as early as possible. You definitely want to sort of take your time in the game and take time to sort of explore the world. And it feels like I said, the overall world is very similar to Breath of the Wild, but I feel like there's a lot of stuff that they added to it that make it almost, it sort of like creates the illusion that it's bigger. They added a lot more, there's a lot more civilization in the game. There's a lot more villages and towns to like go to and all that. And there are definitely a lot more different like individual places to explore, which is good, because again, Breath of the Wild was sort of minimal. It almost feels like that game was sort of a not necessarily prototype, but a sort of proof of concept as to how an open world sort of Zelda game can be. And then this game ends up being like the product of taking that basis and going like further with it. So they add so much stuff in the game that it creates the illusion that it's a lot bigger. Especially considering you also have 2 separate layers of the map you can go to. There's that being the new sky area, which was the area that got the most sort of publicity when the games were first being showcased, and then there's an area below the main overworld, which is pretty much the underworld area, which is definitely a place that you do not want to go to early on in a game. Trust me, I know from experience. And considering that I'm not necessarily the greatest video game player out there on games that aren't Skyrim, I feel like that area is definitely meant for... It's meant to be a place you're supposed to go to later on. But one of the other major things about the gameplay that the developers definitely encourage you to do, and as well lots of people on the internet are doing, which is the new creation tool, where you're able to take certain objects and sort of attach them together to make these sort of like contraptions to help either with like traveling or with fighting enemies and all that. And I definitely gotta say, this game definitely does want you to try to exploit this as much as possible, because if you've seen some of the stuff that people are able to make in this game, like people are able to make pretty much create stuff like makeshift helicopters and like mechs that you can almost that you can pilot to take on enemies, which on one hand that is really cool, because it's such like an absurd concept to think about for a Zelda game, but at the same time giving players that option, I feel like sort of opens up the game to a lot of different like outcomes. Like there are many different ways you could like approach like a certain thing, but I feel like early on, especially early on, again, I only have played the game for a certain amount of time. I feel like the game does give you a lot of it gives you a lot of like bases to like craft stuff with, but I feel like you're not able to do as much with it early on. It sort of is meant to sort of train you into the kind of stuff that you can make, and if you're not of the overly most creative type, I feel like you won't be doing very much in terms of crafting. You can most definitely play through around like 90% of the game without having to do much in terms of crafting at all, unless you really want to try and be creative on how you approach like a certain area and all that. So the sort of like basic gameplay is perfectly serviceable, especially if you were one of those people who enjoyed the combat in Breath of the Wild, and would like to have some more of it. The overall combat is not all too different. You still have all of the variety of different like melee weapons that you can do, which of course, like in the previous game, can break, so you want to make sure to try and save up as many of the really good items as much as possible. And there are, of course, several situations where you are pretty much going to be full on your inventory, so you got to make sure to also not hold on to a bunch of overly weak items. You are able to combine weapons with certain objects that you find in the overworld to give them like a certain buff to them, but I feel like that sort of amounts to using that item for a specific situation, and then after you're done with that, you're pretty much going to drop that item because it's going to be broken not too long afterwards. So again, I feel like there's a lot of creativity with the whole weapon combinations and all that, but I feel like it's still the idea of like the items breaking, especially early on, where the items sort of like break way more quickly than they should. I feel like that's sort of, again, it forces the player to sort of be careful in terms of the battles that they do. But if you're of the conservative type and you know how to like save up items for special situations, then you won't have as overly hard of a time in this game. But again, I feel like the developers should have been a little bit more, I guess generous would be the word that I'm thinking of when it comes to the overall gameplay. I feel like giving the player more of what they need early on would help them get through the game a lot more easily, I want to say. Although that could sort of be the kind of appeal in this game, that you have to like think about where it is you're going to fight and where it is you're going to like use like this item or that item, or use these abilities for like puzzles and all that. That's the sort of appeal in this game, and I feel like that's one of the reasons why people are enjoying it so much, is because the game gives you quite a bit of freedom in terms of how you can approach situations, and I feel like that's one of the things that that's one of like the key things there, is giving you multiple options. and I feel like the game does really excel at that. The game isn't perfect by any means. A few of the abilities I feel like are a bit too situational for certain things, and giving you limitations on items that you were able to get more easily in the previous game, like the bombs and all that. I feel like that could have been sort of done more um, easily, but still overall, I think this game is very much worth the time and patience. Not too sure about the price tag though. I'm not quite sure how I feel about game now being able to cost up to $70 at full retail price rather than the normal $60. Um, but still, um, despite that, I feel like the game overall is very much fantastic. Do I think it is the best Zelda game of all time? That is a bit of a stretch to say, especially I've only played around 60% of the main Zelda titles, so I can't exactly form the most solid opinion on whether or not it's the best, but I can definitely say that it is highly recommended in my book, and if you're one of those people who haven't gotten this game yet, make sure that you do get it, especially considering that the game is still relatively new and it may still be harder and harder to get because, you know, scalpers will always be a thing in this world. So, yeah, I hope you all enjoyed my 2 cents, or my multiple cents at this game here, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Until I see you all next time, by the way, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun talking about my first impressions on this game. So until I see you all next time with whatever it is I decide to talk about, I'm Ben Contreras, and bye.